Awesome. Well, hi everyone. Good morning. Let's dive right into it here. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you just yet, my name is Sam Cameron. I'm the manager of the CSU Advancement Academy here at the CSU Chancellor's Office. And of course, the Academy is the system-wide professional development program for all the areas of advancement. Today, we'll be exploring the methodology for the CASE Alumni Engagement Survey, as well as some key findings from the survey data and ways that alumni relations teams can use that insight to plan engagement efforts. We're joined by two members of the CASE Insights team. Go ahead and wave, you guys. They'll introduce themselves momentarily. As many are aware, but it bears repeating all the same, Cal State universities will be required to complete the full CASE Alumni Engagement Survey starting with the 26-27 fiscal year. That's the survey that opens in the fall of 2027. I hope that this session and the part two of the series on May 14th will help prepare teams who have never participated in the survey to track engagement in the upcoming fiscal year and provide their survey response. There also will be some additional technical training on the survey platform once that survey does open. And then the session on the 14th, if you guys don't already have it on your calendar, we'll drop a link in the chat shortly. But that'll feature CSU teams presenting about their processes for tracking engagement and preparing their responses to the survey. And I hope to see many of you there as well. This session is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording to the Advancement Academy's YouTube channel in a couple of days so that you can share it with colleagues and revisit it as needed. And now I'll just go through a little bit more housekeeping before we jump right into our conversation here. So good idea, everybody, to keep your participants window open. You can go ahead and open that right now. Go ahead and identify your name, probably up towards the top. You can hover your cursor over it to get the three dots and then the rename. And then when you get that pop out, go ahead and make sure it has your first and your last name. And then please go ahead and add in any preferred pronouns and try to squeeze in your university's name, either the short name, the city name, or maybe the abbreviation, just so that everybody here knows where you're joining us from. That also help out our case presenters as well to get a sense of who might be sharing what. Throughout the session, there'll be some points for Q&A. You're welcome to jump off mute or raise a hand at that time. However, through probably most of it, it'll just be folks speaking at you, and it's best if you direct any questions to our presenters via the Q&A pod. That's preferred over the chat just because there'll probably be some other things in the chat and we don't want to lose or get your question get buried there. And with that, I will go ahead and just turn it over to our friends here at CASE to jump right in.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam, and lovely to see so many of you today. We're excited to spend this next hour together and hopefully demystify some of the questions you might have around the CASE Alumni Engagement Framework, the model, and the survey itself. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Perfect. And hopefully that is working correctly on your end.
Looks great.
Uh, Perfect. Thank you so much, Sam. And I just want to echo what Sam said in terms of there's going to be a couple of natural places we'll stop and elicit questions, commentary, feedback, etc. But please, please, please make sure you're not hesitating to get your questions asked. This is really your session today, so we want to make sure that you leave feeling like you have a better understanding than you did when you started. So just to kick it off, I'll introduce myself and then pass things over to Kim. I lead our Case Insights team, and for purposes of what we'll be talking about today, when we talk about Case Insights, we're really thinking about the data, which is really our benchmarking data, of which the Alumni Engagement Survey is part of that. Our our standards, our case global reporting standards, which allows us to benchmark because it's really establishing our common set of measurement. And then, of course, our research. And research we think of as all of the things that often our data through our benchmarks might say, this seems interesting, and it gives us a better idea to dig a little deeper. So really excited to be with all of you today. And Kim, I'll pass things over to you.
I'm Kim Kane. I'm the manager of survey administration on the Case Insights team. I open and manage the survey cycles for the VSE and alumni engagement surveys, help our members with access to the data portal, to the surveys, and to the benchmarking for the CASE member institutions, and answer any questions you might have. I can give you a walkthrough of the survey if you need it, and I can also provide help with benchmarking.
So as you can imagine, Kim's a really important person to know. And my guess is that many of you have probably had questions answered by Kim, whether you knew it or not. And Kim, glad you could join us today. I'm going to kick things off. And then as we get into some of the details of the survey itself, we're going to pop things back over to Kim. But what we'll do today is just start a little bit by talking about how this survey fits into the work that CASE is doing, and specifically about the CASE framework, which includes a little bit around what's measured and what's not, and probably more importantly, some resources to go and access all of that information. Well, also, you're coming to us at a really lucky time of year for you, and that is because we have just finished cleaning and compiling our FY25 survey results. And so while we haven't published that data yet, we feel pretty strongly that it's good to start getting it in front of people. So we'll share some KPIs from fiscal year 25. And then I always think that it's useful to take a step up a little bit and just talk about why this matters, why we care about engagement, and some examples of how institutions are using it. As I mentioned, then we'll pop things over to Kim and talk about some of the survey specifics. And while we did save some time for questions or even discussion amongst yourselves, please do. I find that sometimes if you've got a clarification question, it's better to get that earlier on than having to wait into the end, and we're certainly happy with that. All right, and Sam, would you mind monitoring the Q&A and
Yeah,
just
totally.
interrupting if there's anything that makes sense to address at the time?
You got it.
Perfect, thank you. So I mentioned this, but I think it's always nice just sort of visually to see how this work fits in, because I know the CSU system has been providing CASE with VSE data for many years. And this is sort of, we often call this our orbiting circles graph, because the idea is all of this is made possible through our CASE global reporting standards. But by this, what I'd say in terms of our overarching goal is that we want to help provide the metrics that show success across advancement. And so by that, of course, we've had those philanthropy metrics for many years because of the IRS. They're fairly possible to count and be able to make some good data assumptions on. The Alumni Engagement Metrics Survey is newer, though we amazingly are actually in the sixth year as we look at the FY25 results. And then we are actually in the process of testing out some frameworks around brand and reputation to really build out that idea of how do we start to connect the dots between they're thinking about our institution, we've got our brand out there, to they're engaging with us and making a gift. As we start to fill those pieces out, a key component is understanding the operational aspects of advancement. These are things like collecting staff data, which again, the CSUs have been fantastic about submitting that data to the VSE. We've also got some staffing components in the alumni engagement metrics. And then we actually have a survey on campaigns. It's not an annual survey in the sense that we want you to give us campaign data every year, but it is episodic in the sense that if your institution completed a capital campaign in a fiscal year, and that next year we are asking for some campaign metrics. And the goal is that we have that transparency and accountability in campaign counting, which again sort of is a through line as we look at some of these year-over-year measures. So that's the big picture. But again, today is really all about the alumni engagement survey. And as I mentioned, we have been running this survey since 2019. You'll hear me sometimes go interchangeably the sixth to the seventh year. That's because we made quite a few changes after that first year. We almost think of that as a pilot. So if you look back to trending data, I typically would look at 2020 and further. And typically, because this is still relatively nascent data, we are often just looking at the last 3 years of trends overall. When we wrapped up fiscal 25, we had 398 institutions that took part. It is across 18 countries. And as I mentioned, we built that consistent cohort for trending purposes, but you can see 271 institutions there. Again, this data is coming out next month. With actually a webinar scheduled for June 2nd. And we can certainly follow up with that link to join that webinar as well. We'll go in a little bit more detail on those findings than we are today. So one of the things that anytime I stand in front of a group and talk in CASE Alumni Engagement Metrics that I think is really important to do is spend a moment talking about the who and the what that we're defining here. And so, funny enough, many of you will not be surprised of this. Back in 2018, when CASE produced a white paper that really laid out the framework for this survey that we have today, one of the things we realized at the very onset was we needed to actually establish what we meant when we said alumni. And the reality is, this was the hardest part of the entire project, aligning on that definition of alumni. And so, as you read through that, the takeaways here being this, we've cast quite a large net. I realize that for some of you, you may or may not be doing a ton with your degree holders, or excuse me, your non-degree holders or your certificate holders. But at the end of the day, we felt like if we're looking at the mission of our institutions and we're thinking about the idea that our institutions are here to help people learn, we really wanted to cast that wide net to identify. So you'll see in the survey that we do have some unique, more discrete categories so that we can further define that relationship. The second box that you see here is the subset. So with alumni defined, then we said, okay, what would we actually measure? And the consensus being that legally contactable alumni, meaning they're alive, they have a phone, mail, or email, and there's nothing that is keeping you from reaching out. So if someone said, I hate this institution. I never want you to contact me ever again. Then obviously they're not going to be in your contactable base. Though you may want to reach out in a few years and just make sure. But regardless, this is the idea with that no contact status. I will note that the legal piece, it is a global survey. This is the idea that there are sometimes limitations placed on how long it's been since an interaction, especially in other countries that there could be a reason we couldn't contact. But in general, we're looking at that sort of that base that you are able to reach out to, and you've got some good means to reach out to. So that's the who, and then we can define the what. And so, couple things here. I've included the definition from the white paper at the top of the screen. And you can see we've highlighted the terms mutually beneficial relationship. I think that's a real key component. And we're going to talk a little bit about why engagement matters. I think you'll, find a lot of that mutually beneficial relationship is where we start to see those outcomes that help both the alum as well as the institution itself. And I think particularly with some of the work this system is doing and thinking about career readiness is a really good example of a mutually beneficial outcome to both the alum as well as the institution as you're looking at that ability to continue to put more successful grads out into the workforce. Now, when we look at measuring this, we're essentially saying someone is engaged if they do one of these things at least once a year in one of these modes. And so the modes that you can see are listed here. By volunteering, we are really talking about the things I think you traditionally think of, your boards, your committees, etc. But it really does mean any engagement that has sort of a finite beginning and end. So that certainly could and I think should include micro engagement activities. I think that's a real area that we're seeing a lot of opportunities for institutions overall. And so by that, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that happens with your advancement office or your alumni relations office, et cetera. We're really looking for any kind of volunteering across the institution. An example of that might be, classroom speakers. So again, sometimes there's a lot of work to do to capture that information, but it fits into the definition overall. Philanthropy is going to be the most straightforward. Basically, did they make a gift, hard or soft credit during the year of any amount? As we move to communication, this is probably the squishiest of the four. I will note that in the short version of the survey, communication is optional. So if you're at a place where you said we're going to do a trial year and we're not quite ready for the full, knowing that everybody needs to get there in the next year, know that you've got a little breathing room on that communication piece. I also think this is a place where I know some of the campuses in the system have really collected more in this mode and can be a good resource for each of you. And general communication is going to be where we have our click-throughs. That's going to be the most volume when we look at communication. So whether it's an email that you're sending through, whether it's a text, anyone that's actually clicking through and taking an action, that's going to fit as communication. And in fact, I think the piece with communication that to me is a tried and true test is this question around interactive. So sending out your email newsletter or your newsletter via email is not communication. But sending out your newsletter via email and you have a place that someone could register for an event or click to vote on something that's happening, that is communication. So they really have to take that extra action. And then finally, experiential. Experiential is going to be a little bit of a mixed bag, and that's one reason in the survey you'll see some questions about your program overall. So if you have a traditional dues paying alumni association and you still have members, they're going to count in that experiential category. If you have season ticket holders, and hopefully you're able to capture that information, that fits into experiential, but also events. So, free events, paid events, virtual events, in person, anything to do with events counts there. There's also things like your virtual book clubs, etc. And again, when you look at that little note on the right with the link, I decided not to send you directly to the guidance document because there's so much good information on this one page. But this is the place where you can go and actually access the guidance document, and that is soup to nuts on all the things that count or don't count. But this is actually a really good place for us to stop and see what questions you have. And I'm actually just going to stop sharing for a minute as well. And these can be, does it count? Does it not count? How are you getting this,
A couple
etc.
of clarifying ones already on click-through rates. So folks are wondering if that's for news articles as well or simply activities and surveys.
News articles from the institution, about the institution. Tell me a little bit more on that.
Justin, do you want to give a little context there?
Yeah, you explicitly pulled out things like registering for events and surveys, and so whether it's through the university blog or earned media that we're getting through local, outlets, directing folks to those as well. So in some ways, it fits with the boosting the
Yep.
reputation of the institution, but just wondering if there was an explicit reason that you called those two out, but not others.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd say in general, I wanted to just give a couple of examples. I
Perfect.
think in general, if you're sending something and someone's clicking through and taking an action, that's going to count. What doesn't count is open rates. So if they're just opening it, that is not communication. But if they're opening and clicking, that is.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. One more clarifying one on click-through rates. Does it count if they just click the read more link that's on a specific item?
Yes, I would argue that, they're not gonna be terribly engaged. There's probably other things you want them to do, but we're not, it's a little bit too much manual work to make that next piece. So great question. I think in general, with the click-through rates or anything in communication, there's gonna be a point where you may say, we could get this, but it's gonna be really manual and cause a lot of hours. Don't do that. You can say we can get this because it's something that's automated and it could help us make decisions around how we get people from just clicking the read more button to doing more. That's the kind of thing we're looking for.
Venetia, looks like you have a question too.
Sorry, looking for my mute button. Okay, so I'm listening to I'm looking at the four modes, and I am looking at volunteering, and I have a I'm not sure this is tricky situation, but it's one to see if this could be counted. So on our campus, we have a lot of alumni who are working as employees of the university. And so if one of those employees were to um, uh, speak to a class or attend a class and speak about something. They're not being paid for it. So they might just be, um, sharing their experience or whatever. And it's benefiting the students. Would that be because they're an alum, but they're also an employee? Could we count that, or the fact that they are there as an employee doesn't matter if they're doing it for free or whatever, none of that is counted?
Kim, I feel like we do talk to this in the guidance document. Do you happen to remember off the top of your head?
I do not.
It's a good question, Venetia. I,
Yeah, I'm going back and forth. I'm like,
yeah,
well, they wouldn't have
I feel
been
like
there
that's
if they
one that I can
weren't
say we'll get
employed.
back to you on.
Okay, okay.
In general, I would say if they're doing it in the spirit of volunteering and not part of their job, it should absolutely
Hmm.
be a volunteer. I think you've got a
Okay.
little gray area just on that. Are they doing it because of their job or as
Right, right,
out of the
exactly.
goodness of
Okay.
their heart?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think we had, did I see one more question?
I was just going to say what you said, intent.
Thank you, Stephanie. All right, great. Well,
Looks
thank
like
you all.
we got one more clarifying one. Could you drill down a little bit more into what can be recordable via like, communication and social media pieces? So what would the two-way
Yeah.
communication
So
look like there?
I think social media gets real tricky just because that's a great example of that manual work, right? You could go through and spend hours and hours and hours trying to figure out who are the people that are going on and commenting and clicking and liking all your things. The reality is there's very few platforms out there that capture social media in a way that allow us to do it efficiently. I think I've heard, I think Evertrue is the one that we hear the most. I know that Mongoose is one that we hear on the texting side. I'm not sure if they identify on social media, but the reality is, even with those platforms, we're pretty much getting LinkedIn and Facebook. So I would say, in general, when we look at the communication bucket, most of the volume of data that's going to be in there is our click-through rates. I do know we actually had our benchmarking cohort meeting last week, and Fresno State is part of that group. But there's some testing work that's happening at University of Colorado where they're doing some work collecting handles and then doing some matching on the back end. I think that's going to be wait and see if we feel like that feels like it's going to work. But in general, the folks that have spent much time on this are saying, the people in general that are clicking on our likes and et cetera, if they're not actually, excuse me, the people that are clicking through what we're sending, um, let me back up. The people that are liking the stuff that goes out on social, if they're not actually clicking through on what they're sending, that's not a very high level of engagement. So it's sort of again, it's probably not worth a lot of extra effort to get that data.
Yeah, and this is also a survey that allows you to kind of it meets
Like,
you where you're at.
was taking a video. She had a C-section, so he's taking a video.
Thank you. Um, so it's a survey that lets you kind of start where you're at. So I wouldn't go ahead and try to boil the ocean and track all these little tiny points
Yeah.
of engagement. I think you can focus on things that your team is being very intentional about producing and seeing how that lands. And also like going kind of the risk reward. If it's a lot of work and you're not really sure what you're going to get out of it, maybe hold off on tracking that for a future year. So just, I don't want to overwhelm people with all the different possibilities here of what might be a very kind of complicated mode. So just kind of use your judgment on things that you think are going to be helpful to track and going to have some reward to track it and report on the survey.
And to Sam's point, we're going to show you a couple of ways that we're meeting you where you are in this survey. And again, to me, it's all about reducing uncertainty, which you'll see a slide on that in just a moment. Thank you all. I'm going to go back and share my screen um, to a math problem, but I think it's going to be the only math problem we'll show today. So if we put these pieces together, um, what we're basically saying is if we look at the count of alumni that engaged in at least one of those four modes at least one time during the year, and we're dividing it by the legally contactable alumni, that's how we are arriving at this alumni engagement rate. And so, just to give you an idea of where we see institutions, and this is actually going to be that 2025 data that I mentioned. So, this is a global survey. You can see the global median at 14.7%, which is highly driven by our US Canada participants, which is where the large volume is, which you can see for US Canada specifically. That median is 16.3%. A little bit more about engagement, and this is exactly what Sam was hinting at and what I mentioned in terms of reducing uncertainty. So the reality is we are never going to count engagement because counting means that there is a number that we can actually arrive at, the finite number that's done this. And I'm not going to know who's riding down the road that has a San Jose sticker. There are just so many activities that happen that your alumni are expressing their pride in the institution that no matter all the work you do, we're never going to get that information. And so I want you to consider the philosophy that's been incredibly useful for us as we've thought a lot about how people are using this data. And that is what we're sharing here. And one, it's the idea that we are measuring, not counting. We count gifts, we measure engagement. And as you can see, that piece that's bolded, that really the point we're looking at is that we are reducing the uncertainty about what we're trying to find. So we're never going to say we are counting all of the engagement that happens at an institution, but essentially, if we can learn more, then we can really start to make some good strategic decisions to think about how engagement leads your institution towards important outcomes. Philanthropy being one of those, but certainly not the only. With that philosophy in mind, that is why we have a question on confidence levels. So confidence levels are not you submitted numbers and then we say, hey, did you have the right data in your database? Because we're actually going to operate from a place that what you've put in your database is correct. What we want to know is how representative your data is. And so this is a place where you might say, hey, we've put communication data in. We actually are not able to measure any click-through rates on a wide scale automated way. And therefore, we're not very confident that the communication numbers actually represent what's happening at our institution. Volunteer, you might say, you know what? We actually have our advancement volunteers, those that are involved in our committees and our boards and our regional groups. We know who those are, but once you get outside of this office, we have no idea what's happening on the rest of campus. And so you might be in a somewhat confident perspective. It's a guideline. It's really a gut check here, but it's a place to say, here's sort of where we think we are in terms of that representativeness. And you can see that in general, communication is the one where we see the highest degree of folks that fit into that not very confident. And you can see when we look at experiential and volunteer, experiential slightly a little higher confidence than volunteer, but still we've got a number that find themselves in that middle category. So I just think that's helpful when you're understanding not just your own results, but particularly as you start to benchmark. And then we shared the overall engagement mode of 14.7%. Here's essentially just where that number comes from. So you can see the highest volume in communication, followed by experiential philanthropy. And in general, I would say volunteerism is pretty rare no matter how we slice it. You can also see it's extremely rare for your alumni to be engaged in all four modes, but when they do, they tend to have the highest value to your institution overall when we look at it from a philanthropic capacity perspective. So one of the things I'm always curious when we look at our findings year over year is what direction is it going and why? And I'd say in general, engagement was down just slightly this year. And when we looked at the percentage of engaged compared to the previous year, and I would say the reason is twofold. One you see here. So if we look at the percentage of institutions that increased the count of engaged alumni, we can see that the three non-monetary modes actually went up for the majority of our survey participants. When we looked at the count of alumni donors, just like the trend that we've all seen for many years, alumni donors down, dollars up, we have seen that 42% did increase, but unfortunately, that means the majority still decreased overall in terms of alumni donors. So I told you that's one of two reasons that we saw a slight decline, and that is highlighted here. The other reason, which I imagine might hit home for many of you, is that when we looked at the count of legally contactable alumni, that increased by about 3%. The count of engaged alumni increased by 2%. So it's actually going up, but not at a fast enough rate to match that growing denominator. And depending on your institution, if you had a much higher rate of increase that year, you might even have to work a little harder. So hopefully just some helpful points as you're thinking about this data within the context of your own institutions. Now, I told you I wanted to tell you why we care, and specifically how institutions are using this data. I could do an entire hour on this, so I'm going to try to make it really brief. But there's some great data out here that I think supports one, that you all are doing critically important work, I would say, for society. As well as that some of the things that we're seeing are not unique to higher education. And so, what I'm actually sharing with you are a couple of top line data points from a study called the Generosity Commission findings. The study came out in the fall of 24, and it was essentially commissioned because we were seeing that in every nonprofit sector, including education, that the number of donors was decreasing, but the dollars given was going up. And one of the interesting components of this study, aside from the fact that by 2020, under half of households were giving anywhere, which I think is quite concerning, they also talked a lot about that when you have a smaller group of people that are actually contributing to our nonprofits, and in our cases, contributing to an institution, you're starting to hide a shrinking civic base. So less people that are involved in what's happening in our society overall. And so I pulled out a couple of things from this study of why I thought it mattered to higher education. And I think bottom line is when we look at the engagement data, one, this study actually defines generosity as volunteerism and giving. So they both really go into the same bucket. So one, we see we are able to really start measuring that impact of not just treasure, but including time. And then we also see that, universities are in fact a part of civic society. And so this is something that is directly impacting us overall. Again, I could go into a lot of details on this, but I thought for purposes of today, I would just share how they define generosity. And Sam, I see you had a question.
Yeah, just a clarifying one that came up through the Q&A here, but folks are wondering if the increase in DAF giving has any effect on the giving from households.
That's a great question. In fact, one of the things that came out of this study are essentially 9 recommendations. Some are recommendations for institutions, like building up a volunteer base and thinking about our everyday donors, not talking about future donors, etc. And some are things specifically for how are we collecting data in a way that we can report. So certainly our DAFs, our family foundations are part of that equation, not the only defining factor. What they actually found, because if you think about it, DAFs have had a big impact when we look at the amount of giving overall. It's less on our broad-based giving when we look at numbers. So it's a little impact, but not as big as what this study surmises is probably the peer-to-peer giving data that we just aren't collecting. When you think of things like GoFundMe's, when you think of Venmo, when you think of, how easy it is to just pay somebody directly. And so part of the outcomes of the research is more technology and data capture is needed to figure out what slice of the market that is overall. But you're absolutely right that some of this is data technology and complex gift changes, and some of it is, we saw essentially, and I didn't include this slide for today's purposes, but there is a marked increase in social isolation. That essentially has an impact of smoking 2 cigarettes a day, or excuse me, 2 packs of cigarettes a day when we look at mental health. So it's all these things together, not one factor, but great question. And again, I've just listed how this survey or this commission defined generosity. In the case data, we put mentoring into the volunteer category overall, but you can certainly see a lot of things that I think fit into this greater definition of engagement that as a society and as an industry, I think we're starting to think of as generosity overall. And just this theme of bringing in some of the external research, I thought I would take a moment and share just a couple of slides from the National Alumni Survey. So this is data that just came out in the last month or so, and it's surveys directly from alumni. And we were lucky enough to have Howard Hefner take part in our cohort last week. So I'm just really fresh off of some conversations around thinking about what is that attitudinal data and how does that start to impact some of what we're seeing on our strategies overall. I thought I would just share two key pieces from there that really stuck with me. And one is when they surveyed alumni about how they felt about their institution, or as it's framed here, the product, you can see that in general, folks fit into that satisfied to very satisfied when they're asked about how they valued their student experience, their education, etc. Notice when we asked about the relationship as an alum, now we start to get a lot more neutral fitting into that equation overall, and a little bit more in that not very satisfied category. And this was more evident when we looked at our younger generations. This survey, for the most part, breaks things up at 45 and older and under 45. That's where they found that the behavior shifts really were different. But I think to me, this is all about opportunity, right? Because we don't have a lot of opportunity if they're coming to us from, oh, this wasn't a really good experience, or I felt like that was a waste of money, all those things that we know are part of the equation. But the reality is that's not most. And so I think when we look at what we can do to impact this, that experience to me provides us a lot of opportunities. And as we think about opportunity, I thought I'd just share really briefly something that I've been giving a lot of thought to in the last year or so. There's an excellent book from the researcher Jean Twenge, and it's all about generations. I've cited it here, but the theory that she posits, which I think makes a lot of sense when we think about our own work, is that to understand why we have differences between generations, in the past, we would have said it was really kind of a major event. That is the thing that brought us all together. But if you unpack that more, what it really becomes is technology is providing a slower life for each generation. And it is also has a byproduct of a little bit more individualism because there's a little bit of sacrificing for the greater good is less prized. We see the idea that as people it starts to give way to, we can think about self-positivity. They talked about a data point where if you looked, back in the 60s, if you heard things like, I love me. I am special. That was very rarely seen in documentation. And then when we go to the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, those are very common phrases. So it's this idea of with a slower life strategy and increased individualism, what we are finding is that people are basically getting to adulthood a little bit later and later each generation. And so when you think about the role that alumni may want you to play when it comes to graduating at a traditional, 22 to 25 years old, there may be a lot more adulting that they're looking for their institution to help bridge that gap. And it's something we're actually hearing some success with programs throughout. So just planting that seed, because as I think part of this is not just how are we engaging our alumni? Are we engaging our alumni? But also, what are the things that are moving the needle that they're feeling like are helping improve that relationship overall? Just a couple of data points on what we've seen in terms of that engagement based on, I'm going to say our graduation cohorts, but you certainly could tie those back to key generations. What we've seen in general is that communication is, there's not, while you do see a dip, you see it's relatively consistent throughout. We're getting, the highest in that 0 to 5, but then after that, sort of nice peaks in that 12 to 15% range. But notice what happens when we look at our experiential. There's our clear dip overall, and we think about as people get busy with careers and families, we kind of lose them, but then we're starting to get them back. We can see that our volunteers are very rare across the board, really hovering on that 1%. Again, I think this is such a great opportunity when we think about generosity and impact. And then probably the least surprising data point I will share with you today, the stair steps, right? So that the longer out, the longer we're seeing, or that higher percentage of giving overall. And I think where we can start to see this is there is sort of a crossover pact, our path where we see more people engaging as volunteers and as experiential, but it typically is closer to that 41 years out. So just thinking about sort of those pathways overall. We did do a quick check because we've now had this data for 2 years on the graduation cohorts. And in general, you can see, unfortunately, we're still seeing decreases at the median in philanthropy for really all cohorts. But we do see when you start to dig into those other modes that there are certainly pockets where we're seeing some pretty significant increase across different graduation cohorts. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to make sure you've got plenty of time with Kim, but I will just share a couple of things that will be coming out. One of those is we heard loud and clear that people are looking for stories about people, how people are using this data. And so we asked that question on the survey last year. 97 people responded. We took that and we basically said, okay, what were the top 5 things we heard? So this is in order from 1 to 5. And we've just included some of the quotes that were part of that feedback that we got. So you can see number 1 is this idea about strategic planning and thinking about goal setting. Certainly makes sense that a lot of institutions are thinking about how are we using this and our own benchmarking initiatives. You can see our third most common was simply a common language of collaboration as we think about how are we capturing across an institution, so not just the activities happening within advancement. And then as we round out our top 5, we're getting into the things that certainly we're hearing a lot in CASE, and that is how are we thinking about this in that pipeline between engagement and giving? And how are we talking impact? How are we using this to really share the importance of engagement to an institution? And I'd say one of the takeaways that we had from our cohort meeting last week is now that we've got the numbers, how do we layer in that story of impact and then share the story of the person overall? How are we making sure we're keeping that qualitative data? Because I know you all have amazing stories of this person interacted with our institution, or their first engagement was at an event, or all those kinds of ways that things happen well before a gift happens. These are those kind of stories that I think this data helps to unlock as well. Just looking at time, I want to go through very quickly one super simple example that we've recommended and seen a lot of success for institutions when it comes to how folks are using this data. And that is to take the idea of once we can figure out who's engaged, then simply say, well, if they aren't fitting one of those four modes, they fit into our unengaged bucket. And you can see when we looked at the average for the cohorts, this was about 3/4 of the alumni overall. So this is a place where you could say, gosh, who are they? Is it certain class years? Is it certain colleges? Is it people that are living far away from the institution? All of those things. We looked and saw that about 3% were only giving. So out of those four modes, they're only lighting up on the giving mode. Is this a place where we might think about how to get them more involved? Because we know that the more modes they hit on, the higher revenue per donor there will be overall. We saw our second biggest quadrant being those that are hitting in the volunteer, the experiential, and the communication category, but they're not making a gift. So these are probably going to be our warmest prospects, particularly for those, again, that might be in that experiential or volunteer bucket where we tend to see has a higher likelihood to give. And then our final group, the one that, we probably ideally want to shift as many people as possible to, would be those that are giving and giving and engaging non-monetarily. This example was shared to us originally from the University of Toronto, and we loved it so much. It's something we really built into our reporting overall. So I'm just going to pop over. So how does this all fit together? Well, one of the things that we've seen is that if you're thinking about this as a pipeline, that sometimes just having some numbers to understand, okay, if we're trying to get people to just engage in communication, we know that's where, the largest volume will be, as I shared with you earlier. Well, then we can say, well, how many that we're engaging in communication are we just getting them to do something else? And in general, what we've seen is it takes about 2.5 alumni that you're getting engaged in communication to get them doing at least one thing in those other three modes. We then said, okay, well, what about people that are engaged? How are we then getting them to give? And what we've seen in general, and we took the folks that are just giving out of this equation because the argument would be engagement did not get them to give. But when we looked at that group that wasn't just giving, we saw an average is taking about 4.5 engaged alumni to yield a donor. So as you start thinking about how are we working together, how are we setting some measurements overall, that starts to give you an idea of, that pool you're working with and what some of those conversion rates may be. Finally, I think then we often go back to this idea of, well, what are we trying to accomplish? And so I thought I would share with you an example from Ohio State University that is actually about 6 years old now. And one of the things that they realized in starting to adopt this framework is that it wouldn't be very useful if they, as an institution, didn't have a plan as to what they even wanted people to do. So not just giving for giving's sake, not just engaging for engaging's sake, but what's the real outcome overall. And so they actually spent this day where they brought all these folks together across units and across the institution and ended up mapping out this unaware to advocate continuum. And then you can see identified some activities that would say, well, if this person meets this, they're going to fit into this category. And so what we've done is just color coded that with the CASE model so that you can start to see how you might build that pipeline or think about, if we know what matters to our institution and what those components would be, then we can start thinking about those places. We've seen a number of institutions model this in different ways. I think the real takeaway is this was a collaborative effort and it was something that worked for that institution. I'm seeing a lot of pop-ups, so I'm just going to pause and see, is there anything that I should answer or respond to right now?
No, people just loving this particular model. There is one clarifying thing on the counting, but I think we can touch on that as soon as you wrap up this section.
Okay. Well, I am wrapping it up. So either we can touch on it now or I can pass things over to Kim and then we can touch base at the end.
For sure. So folks just want to confirm for anybody who registered to an event but didn't attend that counts as a communication mode.
That is correct. And part of that is because of the extremely high melt rate on our virtual events that we wanted to be able to identify those that really did take part in that event versus those that, half raised a hand.
Perfect. And then one very interesting question from Justin that I'm going to just make sure everybody can see here. But well, sorry, Justin, you want to elaborate a little bit on that one? It sounds like you're trying to see if folks have mapped out depth of engagement in various modes.
Yes, I mean, and this may be future years conversations, particularly as we're getting more involved as a CSU kind of early in earlier stages for us. But thinking about the impact you talked about, like, needing, what is it, two communication for one experiential, like, or two and a half, flipping that on its head. And is there a like three times engaged through experiential or five times engaged through communication leading to greater increases, whether it's in philanthropy or other engagement or what have you?
Well, and I shared that University of Toronto model. They ended up looking, when they looked at that engage and give, they said, okay, if they are in four modes, what's their value? If they're engaging in three modes, what's their value? If
Mhm.
they're engaging in, et cetera. And what they found is the four modes had a 6 times higher value than those that were just giving. They found that the three modes had a 4 times higher value. They also looked at it across instances and found those that were doing the most, if they were four events during the year or what have you, they saw that that also had a higher value, but not as high as doing connecting in different ways. And I've heard similar anecdotal from other institutions, but I'm begging people to test this more because I think there's something really there.
Thank you.
So I know that y'all are really going to want to get some of these details from Kim. So I am going to pass things over to Kim to talk a little bit about the survey itself.
Thank you, Jenny. Before I plunge into that, I see there's a follow-up question about actual attendance in events versus counting them in communication. So if you are not capturing the actual attendance, you're only capturing the registration, I would say count that in communication because you do not know if the person ultimately did attend. Once you do start capturing who attended, if they did attend the event that they registered for, that's going to count as experiential because you know that they attended that event. If they register and do not attend, that stays in communication. I hope that helps. And right now we are looking at the full version of the survey. The section on the modes of engagement will also take a peek at the shorter version after this. So you will see that you have to report in the 4 basic modes of engagement. We also want to know who has engaged in all 4 modes and who's engaged in any mode, at least one or more than one. And you're providing an unduplicated count in each cell. So if someone, say, attended 5 events, you're only counting them one time here. We're not counting the number of engagements, just the number of people who engaged in the mode. The full version requires you to report your alumni broken out into these unique degree categories, and some will not be relevant for your institution. For example, we have independent and international schools that report. You'll just put zeros across the board for that. If you don't award associate's degrees, zeros across the board. And so these rows, total degreed, total non-degreed, and total alumni automatically total. And the guidance document will have detailed instructions for how you will count in these categories, particularly these non-graduates and other. In the past, for example, on the VSE, alumni were identified by the first degree awarded, frequently an undergraduate degree, but we do have a multiple degree category now. And we have found that the multiple degree alumni are the ones that are very much so engaged, even more so than the ones with just a single degree. And Jenny, I think there's another thing that we'll highlight. So the any of the 4 modes, again, this will be anyone who engaged in any one of these 4 ways. They can have engaged in one or more than one of these, and you would count that person only once here. We just want to know the number of people who have engaged in any way at all. And next up, this is the short version that you can do this year if you're just starting out. This is the version that allows you to skip the communication column if you don't feel confident in your data yet and want to give it another year for the breathing room. And you only report your total degreed and total non-graduates. That would be the people who attended but didn't ultimately get a degree. They earned some credit. And the others like visiting scholars and a number of other categories that fall outside of the traditional degree or diploma holding alum. And Jenny, here again, that
Oh,
again
sorry.
was no, that's okay. That again was that any mode. Again, anyone who participated in any one or more of these 4 basic modes. All right, next up, please. And finally, on both versions, whether you're reporting out in the full version or on the shorter version, we want to know the number in each category who engaged in all 4 modes. So they are your super alum, super engaged alum, who gave, volunteered, came to events, and engaged in active communication. And I think this is a good place to stop for questions.
Yeah.
There was just the one that I want to make sure folks are clear on, but is there a version where if folks can't break out their alumni populations by the different degree types, they can fill in kind of a general row?
So the only option would be the minimal option where you would do total degreed and total non-degreed. There's no option for just total everybody together. So you have to at least be able to know if your alum had a degree or did not earn a degree.
Thank you, Kim.
Sure.
All right, well, I'll pop in for just a moment then and mention that obviously part of the question is, well, what's in it for you? Hopefully you'll feel like a lot. One of those is that as a CASE member, you actually will have, or you do have access to the data portal. And you may have used this for the VSE data. It's the same system, but essentially you could go in there right now, even if your institution has never filled out the Alumni Engagement Survey, and get detailed benchmarks today. So if you wanted to see, you've got peer institutions and you want to know if they're doing a survey and know what they're reported, that is available to you as a CASE member. Kim's going to talk a little bit more about the data portal in a moment. You also, if you fill out the survey or when you fill out the survey, you will get what we call our summary benchmarking report. And that is really our gift to you to say, here's some things you might want to start with. So we've identified 5 key metrics. We're sharing with you how you compare to a group of peers based on an algorithm, as well as to the general population. So that's an easy way to access that. We've got a slide on that data in just a moment. And then finally, I mentioned our cohort. That's an example of our additional services. If you're already doing the survey and you are curious about taking part, I'm sure that Jackie and Letitia would be happy to give you more info from Fresno State. I will tell you, we do still have a couple of seats left for our next group that's meeting in June in San Marcos, which I just learned is called San Marvelous, which is kind of fun. But at the end of the day, what I want you to know is CASE is here to help, whether that's helping you do it on your own or whether you want to work with us more and using this data. I think there's so much that can be gained. And here is the summary benchmarking report. We've actually put it right into the data portal under resources, so that everybody at an institution, no matter if you're the person working with alumni engagement or you're the person that's focused on planned giving, that survey report is available to you. And Kim, I'm going to pass things over to you.
All right. So for case members, the data portal benchmarking, this is a sample of what a benchmarking report will look like. You'll see these first several columns have sort of institutional data, and then following that would come the columns with the actual raw data from the survey variables. There are a number of different tools in the data portal that you can use to create a report. You can create your own groups for comparison if you have a specific group of peers or aspirant institutions that you want to create. There are also public groups available that we've created, for example, based on Carnegie classification and research designation that you can use right away. We have some pre-existing reports like the Alumni Engagement Summary Report that covers total engaged in the modes and percentage engaged in the modes, plus some individual other variables. And so if anyone does not yet have access, is a member and doesn't have access to the data portal benchmarking, you would see it in the Insights data portal in the header. There'd be a benchmarking tab. Shoot an email to insights@case.org and we can give you the access for that. And if you have any questions about using it or you want a walkthrough of how to use the tools, again, shoot us an email and we can schedule some time to help walk you through it.
And I just wanted to thank you all for your time today, for your interactivity. We are really here to support you. I can tell you CASE is very excited about a year from now, all of the CSUs taking part in this survey. And because of that, we certainly want to make sure that we make it as frictionless as possible for your teams.
Thank you, Kim and Jenny, for joining us. Folks, you're welcome to use your reactions button to give our presenters here a round of applause. There we go. Thank you. I know we're right at time, but Jenny, Kim, are you guys available for a few extra minutes just in case anybody does have any lingering questions? Thank you so much. Awesome.
Certainly.
Awesome. Well, thank you. If you don't have any questions, thank you for joining us this morning. I dropped the link in the chat again for a part 2 of the webinars for this survey. That's going to feature again our awesome colleagues showing us how they did this survey in the last couple of years. So you don't want to miss that. That's where we get into the nuts and bolts. And yeah, if you have any other questions on kind of the counting and the structure of the survey, please let us know.